It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the BenQ EX3210U. As usual, be aware that what you see on the video depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see by eye when observing the monitor. There's a full vision review, which this video is really a part of. You can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, also a nice way of showing your support. In this video, I'll mainly be using in-game examples, a bit on the desktop as well, just to give some nice visual demonstrations of some of the things I analyse in more technical detail in the vision review. And although they're in-game examples, these areas of the monitor's performance, which I'm looking at, they will apply more broadly as well when you're just on the desktop, if you're watching movies, whatever it is you might be doing. So this monitor has a 32-inch 4K UHD, that's 3840 by 2160 IPS type panel, more specifically an AU Optronics AHVA, Advanced Hyper Viewing Angle panel. And this resolution and screen size combination gives you a really nice amount of desktop real estate. So I'm happy to use this without any scaling, and that gives me a really nice amount of text on the screen at the same time. Excellent for multitasking, and that text, again, this isn't something you can really appreciate in the video, but the clarity is excellent for that text. It's really crisp, it's very readable, so the high pixel density really helps in that respect, and suitably high resolution image content also benefits from this high pixel density, and that would include 4K movie content and certainly games as well. And with those in mind, the 4K UHD experience section of the vision review explores that a little bit more subjectively, and also links to an article with greater analysis on that aspect. Something which the article also points out is that if you do happen to use scaling, so let's say you were using scaling in Windows, or you're using application-specific zoom, so you're making text larger, that doesn't detract from the clarity, that doesn't make the high pixel density useless at all. You still benefit from the high pixel density, so this text still looks crisp in a way that it wouldn't on a display with lower pixel density. This requires that the application scales cleanly, and in most cases they do. Web browsers, word processors, many applications now will scale properly, scale cleanly, so that's not really an issue. It used to be an issue when 4K UHD models were new. I used to have issues with this all the time, but now it's really not something I'd be concerned about if you want to be using scaling. From the front you can see distinctive MOBIUZ styling. So the bottom bezel there, that has a kind of speaker grill texture. It's a plastic speaker grill texture. There's a central sensor unit used for the BI Plus and HDRI functionality. Little dedicated HDRI button there as well. The stand base, I have to say I'm not a huge fan of this. Of course, subjective and all that, but on the inside it's kind of got, well, from a distance it looks coral red or orange, depending on the lighting. Closer inspection you can actually see it has diagonal stripes alternating between orange and purple. And then the rest of it's a silver plastic. I just don't like the feel of the stand. It's really very plasticky, and with what looks like basically a sticker in the middle, it kind of just feels like a toy rather than something you'd associate with a premium monitor. I would have much preferred just sort of a plain metal stand. And I know not everyone's going to be a fan of the overall shape of the stand and that kind of thing. Aside from that though, it's pretty solid. It's got a nice solid lump of white matte plastic in the middle there, weighted by metal, so that gives good solidity to the overall screen, good weight, good heft. And it's reasonably solid otherwise. Stand isn't super deep either. I give full dimensions in the features and aesthetics section of the vision review. So in terms of the ergonomic flexibility, you can adjust the height of the monitor, you can tilt it backwards and forwards a little bit, and you can swivel it left and right. There's no pivot into portrait. The exact adjustability can be found in the vision review. So just quickly coming back to that speaker grill I mentioned, it does actually house two 3-watt Trevolo speakers, which are BenQ branded ones. And there's also a subwoofer at the back, which is 5 watts, and together they do offer quite good sound output, certainly good for integrated monitor speakers. They offer good volume control with a good minimum volume, decent maximum volume, and plenty of adjustment range between those. Decent bassiness, the trebles, and just the general sound quality, it's pretty decent actually. It's not sort of crushed together or tinny or hollow sounding or anything like that. And I cover this a bit more in the features and aesthetics section of the vision review. The top and side bezels are slim. There's that dual stage design, so you've got a hard plastic outer part, and there's also a panel border, a thin panel border. It's difficult to see when the monitor's off as it is now, but you'll see it when it's switched on. It just blends in seamlessly with the rest of the screen. It's flush with the rest of the screen. The main feature, of course, is the screen itself, and that has what I would classify as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface. This is just a very broad subjective classification. I would put it a bit more on the very light end of that spectrum as well. But what this means basically is it does offer decent glare handling. You can see a big patch of glare there, and that's because of a strong light coming from a door to the right of me. And you can also get a glassy look, you'll be able to see that there. You can see that from a normal viewing position if you've got direct light striking the screen surface, it gives a kind of glassy appearance, and you might get that in a very bright room just more generally. And some people really like that look. It's just a characteristic, but overall, good glare handling. You certainly don't get the kind of sharp reflections that you'd see on a glossy screen surface, for example, and the level of diffusion of light is reduced compared to stronger matte screen surfaces. So they tend to sort of haze the image up, flood the image, and yes, that does happen to an extent here because it's still a matte anti-glare screen surface, but you generally find sharper glare patches and less of this heavily diffused glare. There's also other benefits to the screen surface, and they are explored in relation to contrast a little bit deeper into the review. From the rear, it's dominated by white matte plastic. There's that subwoofer I was talking about at the top there. Before I completely forget to mention as well, there is a remote for this model, which gives convenient access to the OSD. You can also control the OSD with a little joystick at the bottom of the screen, just to the right of centre, underhanging the bottom bezel. And this is all explored in a separate OSD video on the channel. The stand attaches centrally via a quick release mechanism. So you press that button there, you can quickly detach the included stand. That will reveal provision for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting. There's also a K-slot there, and there's a cable tidy loop at the bottom of the stand there, with the kind of upwards angle there, so you can just feed cables through there to tidy things up a little bit. These little strips here, these bars, they're actually RGB LED lights. They're not particularly bright, so really you can only see them from the back. There's a little bit of a glow around the monitor if the room's dark enough, but it doesn't act as a bias light. It's not strong. It's not really a feature from the front. It's more something you could see from the rear of the screen. And as shown in the OSD video, you can customize these. There's also a shiny silver-coloured MOBIUZ logo at the left side there. The ports face downwards beneath a removable plastic port cover. You've got a DC power input, so there's an external power brick. It's not a particularly large one. It's quite a slimline design, as you can see. There are two HDMI 2.1 ports. There's DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack. And there are four USB 3.0 ports. The final one there has 1.5 amps power support, and there's also a USB upstream port, the USB Type-B port. In terms of the capabilities of the main ports, HDMI 2.1 is full bandwidth HDMI 2.1, so that's 48 gigabits per second. So that means you can have the full color signal capability on all systems, PC, Xbox, and the PS5. And that's limited to a maximum of 120 Hz, even as a PC user, at the full 3840 by 2160. That's not for bandwidth reasons, that's just how they've configured the port. If you want 144 Hz as a PC user, just connect via DisplayPort 1.4, you get that. And with both of those display connections, you have support for adaptive sync. There's also HDMI 2.1 VRR, and with adaptive sync, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, and you can also use AMD FreeSync, or more specifically AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, which this monitor supports, as well as Intel's VRR technologies, which rely on adaptive sync. And you also get support for HDR at the same time as all of this, if you wish, via both HDMI and DisplayPort. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about contrast using some in-game examples. As an IPS type panel, contrast is not the main strength of this one. I measured a little bit under 1000:1 using my test settings. It's a little bit stronger than some IPS type panels, but some are also a bit stronger than this, so this is sort of quite average, I suppose, really. Not particularly strong in that respect. I should note as well that my test settings happens to have all of the colour channels at the neutral position, which maximises contrast. That just happened to work on my unit. That's not necessarily going to be the case. If you have to make colour channel adjustments, then that can also reduce contrast a bit more. And you will be able to see at some points a bit of IPS glow. Again, that's at a moderate level, an expected level for an IPS type panel of this size. It tends to appear as a cool haze towards the bottom corners of the screen, and you can see it a bit higher up as well, perhaps not on this particular scene, but because of the size of the screen, you might see it a little bit towards the top of the screen at times. and it can appear slightly warm up there. So this does affect the atmosphere, it affects the depth of these dark shades. It's something which is increased if you're sitting closer to the monitor, if you're using a high brightness setting, and it would also be increased if your unit has issues with backlight bleed or clouding. My unit wasn't too bad in that respect. If you refer to the contrast section of the written review, you'll see a picture showing that there. A strength of this IPS type panel is its strong gamma consistency. I should also mention that the gamma calibration itself is quite wacky on this model actually, especially out of the box, or if you just switch to the custom setting and just use the settings they give you by default there. It doesn't track the 2.2 curve properly. Some shades are too bright, some are too dark, and this did actually affect the atmosphere in the dark scenes a bit because it sort of lifted up dark shades so they're brighter than they should be. It gives a slightly flooded look, I'd say, in places. Depends on the scene. But I was able to improve this, and again, you can see this in the calibration section of the written review. My test settings listed there. It has a light tuner setting and a gamma setting, and with a certain combination of this, I was able to get close to the 2.2 curve, but not tracking it perfectly. So the gamma is a little bit wonky on this, but not too bad after tweaking. Certainly not for general purpose use and gaming. And if you fully calibrate the monitor, profile it, then you can improve that. So for color critical work and that kind of thing. But the consistency of the gamma is excellent across the screen. So that means that the depth of these dark shades, aside from the areas affected by the IPS glow, that does of course affect the detail levels, it is generally very good. So compared to TN models where you have this obvious gradient from top to bottom of detail for dark areas and just affecting shades more generally. And with VA models, you have a central area of black crush, and that can vary between models. Some VA models, modern VA models, tend to be better than they used to be in that respect, but there's still some degree of it there. And especially on a screen of this size, a VA panel of this size, you will see some shifts in gamma looking at the outside of the screen, the peripheral regions comparing to the center, and that can actually introduce extra unintended detail. So the consistency here is really good, except for the IPS glow. For brighter shades, such as the nice fire here, the screen surface, it's what I'd describe as a very light matte anti-glare screen surface. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't have the kind of layering that some matte screen surfaces provide, stronger matte screen surfaces, and the finish to the surface is fairly smooth, so it doesn't have strong or obvious or heavy or coarse, whatever you want to call it, graininess, just a little bit of fine misty graininess. Moving on now to the colour reproduction, I like to start off with Lagom, lagom.nl, the website, and the tests for viewing angles there. So the Lagom text, this would ideally appear a blended grey throughout the screen. You'll be able to see that actually it has a red stripe, dark red striping to the text. And this could be because of the somewhat funky gamma calibration, which I mentioned just before in relation to contrast. The generous colour gamut can also contribute to the intensity of the red there. The pink block, this always looks really weird on the camera. You'll just have to bear with my description of this one. It looks a pinkish purple throughout the screen. The pink hue is a little bit stronger towards the extreme edges of the screen, but it's not an obvious or strong shift. Not as strong as you'd see on TN or VA models. And with a bit of head movement, yes, there is a slight shift in this pink hue, but it's not extreme. And again, remember that the camera captures this very oddly. For the red block, this appears a vibrant red throughout the screen. It's just a little bit duller towards the extreme edges, just a little bit. Again, this is a subtle shift. And these shifts I'm talking about, it does depend on your viewing position and your viewing distance. So if you're sitting further from the screen, these shifts are less apparent. I tend to sit around 70 centimeters or perhaps 70 to 80 centimeters when I test monitors and when I use them more generally. So my observations are from this viewing distance. The green block, nice saturated green chartreuse shade throughout the screen. Very slightly lighter, if I'm being picky, towards the extreme edges of the screen, but again, this is a subtle shift. It's not like you'd see on VA or TN models. Blue block has a good consistent royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. Most content you consume under SDR, and that includes this game, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and when your monitor has a wider gamut than sRGB, it invites extra vibrancy and extra saturation. This monitor certainly does extend beyond sRGB a lot natively. It has a generous gamut which covers 96% of the DCI P3 colour space and 100% of the Adobe RGB colour space. There's also a bit of extension beyond both colour spaces. And you can see the full analysis in the colour reproduction section of the written review, but I'm just going to flash up an image showing comparison with the DCI-P3 colour space, just so you can help visualise this gamut. So these earthy browns, on this particular scene they're kind of slightly reddish brown, but the red component is brought out rather strongly because of the generous gamut. The red of this container there is very vibrant as well, very eye-catching. Just generally the tree trunks as well, they have a bit more of a red or strong reddish orange hue rather than a more neutral brown. The colour gamut is also very generous in the green region, and actually the green to blue edge, so covering the cyans as well, so the sky blue there has a lot of pop to it. There are some very lush looking greens, but also some greens that look rather bright, rather more eye-catching than they should. So some of the muted greens aren't as muted as they should be, and just generally there is so much really have this pop to them, which some would consider a bit over the top, overdone. And you can see with skin tones as well, not for the green specifically, unless someone's a little bit ill perhaps, but skin tones tend to show a bit of a sun-kissed look, a bit too rich. I wouldn't say strongly sunburnt, maybe a little bit towards that side of things, but basically it's just extra saturation, extra vibrancy. Some people like this look. It's certainly something that this monitor delivers rather strongly. If you prefer things to look more as the developers intend, something I describe as a rich and natural look, this monitor does provide an sRGB emulation setting which will clamp the gamut to sRGB instead, and you just switch the colour mode over to not e-paper. That I mean, if you really don't like colours, e-paper works actually, just makes everything nice and grayscale. sRGB, there we are. So with this setting, you can adjust the brightness, which is nice. You can adjust AMA as well, advanced motion acceleration, the pixel overdrive of the monitor. You can't adjust the colour channels, however. They are locked to the factory default setting, and unfortunately on my unit that makes things a bit cool tinted, a little bit green as well. Green channel's a bit strong as well, but you can certainly adjust the brightness, sharpness if you wish as well. Really the main settings of note in my opinion that are locked off: colour temperature, colour channels and gamma. Anyway, the look is far more subdued now. The reds of this container, for example, they don't pop as much. Browns are more neutral, yes, slightly reddish brown, but that's because they're naturally slightly reddish browns in this particular scene anyway. The tree trunks, more neutral brown, they don't have that kind of red or orangey red pop. Sky blue's toned down as well, and the lushness of some of those greens has certainly been diminished, but they don't look overly bright or slightly neon actually, as they looked before. So again, this is a look which some will prefer. I can completely sympathise with people liking this, and I can also sympathise with people preferring the more vibrant look of the native gamut, to be honest, because if you think about scenes like this in the real world, there are going to be shades that are way beyond the sRGB colour space, but by the same token, they won't be as oversaturated or sort of, some might say, out of place as they would be when using the native gamut, with this content actually being designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. So yes, the monitor does accommodate both sides of things. I wouldn't say it's a perfect sRGB emulation setting in terms of its adjustability, but actually in terms of the gamut it provides, it's very good, very close tracking to sRGB. I'll just flash that up on the screen for reference. So yeah, very little extension beyond sRGB there, 100% coverage. Good to see. Though personally would have preferred more flexibility in terms of the colour channels and that kind of thing. As you can see in the review as well, the gamma tracking is better in this setting for the 2.2 curve than it was by default of actually using any other setting. And I've just quickly switched back over to my test settings just so you've got a little bit of a visual comparison in the video. Again, be aware that you're not going to be able to see what things actually look like firsthand on the monitor, but even so, you should be able to see a definite difference in overall saturation between sRGB and the native gamut of the monitor. And just a quick final note, I should have really mentioned earlier, but the colour consistency, the strong colour consistency I mentioned with Lagom, that's all in play when you're gaming as well and just observing other content. So shades maintain this saturation and richness very well throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm running this game under HDR. I actually think this is a very nice test for HDR, this game. I know I usually show Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but for a little bit of variety I thought I'd move on to Battlefield 5. If I'm honest, I'm getting a little bit sick of testing Shadow of the Tomb Raider under HDR and sort of mainly sticking to that. So I'd just like to give you a little bit of variety, and as I said, really good HDR implementation on this game. It's one although I don't always talk about it, I do test this on pretty much every monitor under HDR that I use. So I'm very familiar with this, and I do like the HDR implementation. So this monitor under HDR, it definitely gives a different look to things compared to SDR. A few things to be aware of. I have this monitor connected via DisplayPort to an NVIDIA RTX 3090. I tested with HDMI as well, exactly the same on this NVIDIA GPU. I also tested with my AMD GPU and via DisplayPort, very similar experience to what I have experienced on my NVIDIA GPU. Hooking up my AMD GPU via HDMI though, things looked unusually muted and dull. I'm not sure what that was all about. Could have been a driver issue, could have been the fact that I was using an RX 580, which doesn't have an HDMI 2.1 port, although I did test at 60 Hz as well, and the bandwidth there should be absolutely fine, so not a problem. But for whatever reason, a bit weird. I'm not sure what was going on there. But what I'm going to be talking about here, with HDR working properly on this monitor, that would apply to games consoles as well, and it would apply if you are viewing video content rather than playing games. But as with games, some movie content does show off HDR better or make better use of HDR than others. So on this monitor, there are three main HDR modes. Display HDR, which is my preferred setting, I'll come back to this shortly. There's Game HDRI and Cinema HDRI as well. These two settings are quite weird, and I could just leave it there, but I'm a bit more thorough than that. So they're weird because they make use of the light sensor of the monitor, which is used for the BI+, Brightness Intelligence Plus functionality under SDR, and that works as you'd expect under SDR, but this really doesn't make sense under HDR, because what it will be doing is it's limiting your brightness. It's also making changes based on the image, based on your ambient lighting, which will go against the intended look of HDR. So there are specific parameters which are followed for HDR10 content, and this just goes against that. I mean, I could talk at length about the kind of changes it makes, the specific changes, but I really don't think it's worth it. It just doesn't look right. It looks sort of overly contrasty. The gamma's all over the place, so the EOTF curve wouldn't be tracked properly in the case of HDR. The Cinema HDR setting has even more depth, a sort of a bit of a richer look, really. And in terms of the brightness, it's just not, it really just limits it. And I tested in a range of different lighting environments. You can see that in the contrast table in the written review. And I actually found, even with the sensitivity ramped right up, it just didn't make dramatic changes, even if the room was very bright versus completely pitch black and anything in between. So there's something really odd with these settings. Anyway, I wouldn't use them. Display HDR is definitely the one I'd recommend using. And with this, there's an important setting to be aware of. So you'll see that a lot of this is grayed out, a lot of the menu is inaccessible. You can adjust the sharpness according to your taste. AMA is available. You can't change brightness, light tuner, color vibrance, all of that stuff. There's an important setting here though, backlight control. This monitor is VESA DisplayHDR 600 certified, and part of that certification means that it does need to be using local dimming to be able to achieve sort of the contrast requirements for that test, really. And that is exactly what this backlight control setting controls. So with this on, it will be using local dimming. With it off, it doesn't use local dimming. Now, it's easier to show you what this does out of game with some sort of very sort of artificial scenario, which I'm going to show you here. Very easy to show you how the dimming zones are arranged on this one. I'm just on Microsoft Paint. I've got HDR enabled with backlight control enabled. You'll be able to see, basically they're arranged as vertical columns. So they run from the top to the bottom of the screen, 16 zones from left to right. And yes, you do have a kind of spotlighting effect at the bottom. That's where the backlight elements are actually located. So it is strongest there, this sort of bloom. Also be aware that this isn't the monitor sort of fully brightening up that zone, because the mouse cursor is just a small element, a small bright element. The rest of the screen is dark. This monitor, as I explore more in the written review, it tends to dark bias. And that means that if there's a mixture of light and dark content, because most content you view is not going to be just pure black with a little bit of white mixed in, it's going to be far more mixed than that. It will tend to dark bias, which means it won't brighten up to super bright levels. If there's a lot of bright content, then yes, that will be what it takes to brighten up the zone to much higher levels. But anyway, you can see what the zones do here. Very easy to demonstrate. Backlight control off now. And you can see there's no local dimming behavior. The entire screen has elevated black depth. It doesn't shoot to extremely high levels of brightness. It's sort of at a moderately bright level, but it just stays there. It doesn't adjust. There's no sort of dynamic contrast element with this either. So back to the game now. In terms of the brightness, as I said, this is VESA DisplayHDR 600 certified, and that really gets its name from the fact that the monitor is supposed to be reaching a peak brightness of at least 600 nits. I wasn't able to achieve that with my testing, and I tested this extensively, not just with specific test patches, but also in-game I took various brightness measurements. So with a scene like this, you might expect, for example, the sun there to be very bright, and it is, to be fair, quite bright, but I was never able to reach 600 candles per meter squared, 600 nits. I'll just show you measurements with various different patch sizes, or some people would refer to this as window sizes, so different percentages of white on the screen with a black background where applicable. So you'll see that it never reached 600. It did reach a bit above 500, but that's not quite there. And you can also see the dark biasing behavior, which I mentioned. So if the test patch was not particularly large, this means that it was surrounded by black and there was mainly black on the screen. Then the dimming zone, which has the white patch with the black background, it does shift towards a dark bias rather than bright bias. So some models, in contrast, would really just pump up that zone really brightly. There are pros and cons to each approach. So with dark biasing, it means that you're not generally as aware of the dimming zones and their behavior, and you won't get that kind of flooded look I showed you in Microsoft Paint very clearly as much. Either way, not going to beat around the bush here. 16 dimming zones is a very limited number of dimming zones. It does give you a situational boost in contrast, but it is really no substitute for FALD, full array local dimming, a very large number of dimming zones. It certainly doesn't compare to OLED with effectively millions of dimming zones per pixel illumination. It doesn't achieve the kind of atmosphere even when there's lots of dark on the screen. So you can see here even, where I'm just showing this darkly painted truck, I'm right next to it. The dimming zones can't shut off completely because it's not just pure black. Also, there are little bright elements. It's very common in games, bright elements, which will stop them achieving full dimming. But if I look at this scene here, for example, the dimming zones there are darker than they otherwise would be without local dimming. The dimming zones there brighten up somewhat. So yeah, it kind of does help, but still a very limited HDR experience in terms of the contrast, and indeed, in this case, the brightness. So coming back to the brightness for a bit, good pop to the fire, good pop to the daylight sky, not as much as I've seen on some models, even of this HDR certification level, and certainly when comparing to high levels of HDR. So this scene here sometimes has a real amazing glow to the clouds here, of sort of lifelike look really to the bright scene here. In this one, you just don't get that. And of course, more precise illumination would allow the bright elements alone to stand out really nicely, whereas the darker elements, the medium shades, they would be deeper. And just in general, the depth of those medium shades isn't as impressive as it could be because of the lack of precision to the illumination. With that out of the way, a few advantages to running HDR on this monitor, and that's that it runs with 10-bit color processing. This monitor does support that with the help of dithering on the monitor. And this means that you get an enhanced nuanced shade variety. So this works for brighter shades, smoother gradients, gentler shade progressions for weather effects, light in general, fog, smoke, that kind of thing. And again, this can be put to better use in some titles than others. And for dark shades, there's an enhanced nuanced shade variety, so it gives a sort of natural uplift of detail, which doesn't look flooded, it doesn't look artificial, as you might get with a gamma enhancement under SDR, such as if you were to use black equalizer or increase the light tuner, for example. It also allows the monitor to put its generous color gamut to good use. So under HDR, the developers target wide color spaces, DCI P3 and ultimately Rec 2020 rather than sRGB. So having that wide color gamut actually makes more sense here in terms of the developers being able to put really nice vibrancy where they want it. So the fires here, for example, there's some really rich oranges, some nice reddish oranges and yellows all mixed together, all looking as they should. You can't really see it so much in this scene, but just more generally, there are some really nice lush greens, but greens which should look more muted do look more muted. And actually this monitor extends quite a bit beyond DCI P3 in the green region, or the green to blue region, and encroaches more on Rec 2020, so you can actually get some extra vibrancy for those green shades as well, beyond what you'd see on a monitor which really just tracks DCI P3 more closely, so that's quite good to see as well. I should mention as well the wood of these rifles and the autumnal colours here. They're toned down compared to under SDR. They don't look oversaturated, but they do look appropriately saturated. They have a really nice richness, which you wouldn't get with sRGB emulation under SDR either. So again, it's all about putting that wide color gamut to appropriate use. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5, just to really reinforce some of the points I've already made and just show you some more examples of the monitor in action. So this scene really is quite typical actually of scenes which can look very impressive or not so impressive under HDR. There's a complex mixture of bright and dark shades, and as you might expect, the dimming zones really are far too limited on this model to be able to account for these intricate mixtures of light and dark. So things really just kind of look quite hazy overall. There can be some situational boosts in places. For example, when I look here, the dimming zones there can be relatively bright because it's showing that nice bright light there versus those dimming zones. But then again, you can see that there are embers here, and it does have to brighten up there. The monitor is nowhere is the monitor just displaying large areas of pure black. So it's really quite unfavorable for the dimming zones. And it really does show the limitations of this kind of 16-zone local dimming solution, even if there are some situational improvements in some circumstances. The scene also highlights the 10-bit color reproduction nicely, so sort of the smoke effects have smoother gradients, nuanced shade varieties improved, so there's some nice subtle details for very dark shades, a better variety of closely matching dark shades, so that's nice to see. Can't really say too much about the colour gamut here, except that those embers have a really beautiful sort of orange glow. Again, these are rich beyond what you'd see with sRGB emulation under SDR. That's because this is an example of shades which are actually well beyond the sRGB colour space. Obviously not the most colourful scene in general, but just thought I'd point that out. So yeah, not really too much more to say about this. The HDR on this one, I mean, yes, it's above average, but that's really not saying much. It is still very limited, and can't shake that sense of disappointment that I wasn't really able to get the same kind of luminance levels on this one as I've seen on some models even with the same DisplayHDR 600 certification. So the Acer XB323U GP, for example, that's a model which I was able to get close to 800 nits peak, so there's a big difference between that and 500, a big visual difference. And so it just doesn't have the same pop to those bright elements. And I'm not really as impressed with this one in that sense as I have been with some others, even at this tier. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has 144Hz refresh rate. I've got the game running at 144 frames a second. You can see that in the top right corner. You might not be able to see it because it's a very small little green number, but it's running a nice solid 144 frames a second. So I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of responsiveness. When it comes to responsiveness, it's a very important concept to understand called perceived blur. That's explored in the written review, or summarized a little bit in the written review, and also explored in an article linked to there all about monitor responsiveness. So there are two main contributors to this. The first one is the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen, and this is closely linked to the refresh rate, 144Hz in this case maximum. So compared to a 60Hz monitor, or this monitor running at 60Hz, or indeed 60 frames a second, I get 2.4 times as much visual information outputted every second, and that significantly decreases this perceived blur due to eye movement. The high refresh rate, high frame rate combination also improves the connected feel, which describes the precision and fluidity when I'm interacting with my character on the game or interacting with the game world, and that's something which is also aided by low input lag. In this case, the signal delay is very low. On this monitor, I measured a very low input lag, below 3 milliseconds, which includes both the signal delay and an element of pixel responsiveness. So that's really impressive in terms of its signal delay. That shouldn't cause issues for even sensitive users. The other aspect to consider when it comes to perceived blur is pixel responsiveness. And this monitor doesn't use a panel which is particularly fast. As far as modern IPS type panels go, this is, I'd say, kind of middling really in terms of its responsiveness. However, BenQ have actually tuned it very well, or they have settings which help you get a lot out of the monitor. It has a setting AMA, Advanced Motion Acceleration. That's how you control the pixel overdrive or the gray to gray acceleration levels. I'm going to show you some pursuit photographs taken on this monitor with various different AMA settings at 144Hz. So this is a bit of a difficult one to interpret actually. I would definitely recommend looking at the analysis given in the responsiveness section of the written review in this case. But basically there are two settings which I would choose between. There's AMA 1 and AMA 2. And the correct setting really depends on your own preferences for what I would call powdery trailing or conventional weaknesses in pixel responsiveness versus overshoot. So if you can tolerate a moderate amount of overshoot, then AMA 2 might be more appealing. Otherwise, AMA 1, you might feel that's better balanced. I also included some reference screens there, the Gigabyte M32U, which is actually quite a fast and well-tuned IPS monitor, and also the ASUS PG32UQX. Just be aware that you're only looking at a few transitions here, or a relatively slim number of transitions with the Pursuit photographs. And just considering sort of broader analysis, there are some weaknesses on this monitor, and I'll try and highlight them a little bit further on, which wouldn't be apparent on the M32U. So in general, the pixel responsiveness is a little bit weaker than the M32U. However, compared to the PG32UQX, the weaknesses are massively reduced. And although I haven't reviewed other monitors using this particular AUO panel, the same one as the EX3210U, I've been tracking the data from other review sources, Pursuit photographs, measured response times, that kind of thing. And it does seem that this BenQ has a bit of an edge compared to them in terms of its pixel responsiveness. So they've definitely tuned things well, and really they've pushed the panel as far as they can. So I'm using AMA 2 here. So yes, I do get a moderate amount of overshoot. You might not be able to see that in the video. It's not extreme overshoot, but I just can see it in places as bright halo trailing, which is a bit brighter than the background shade as I move with certain backgrounds and certain objects. It tends to be where lighter shades are involved in the transition, or medium to lighter shades, but not exclusively. So some people might find this too eye-catching. If you do, AMA 1 might be preferred. Personally, I do find this overshoot a little bit higher than I'd usually like to see, but I do actually find the reduction in perceived blur quite easy to notice compared to AMA 1 on this monitor. So overall I prefer the balance of AMA 2, which is why I'm using it, but really you have to make your own decision on that one. In terms of weaknesses, in terms of conventional trailing, or what I like to call powdery trailing in this case, mainly where very dark or very bright shades are involved. So this white text and white marker there, for example, there's a fair bit of this powdery trailing, and you do just get it elsewhere. So there's just a little bit of a mask of this powdery trailing in places. For the transitions in this scene, they're mainly medium to brighter shades, and actually they're generally performed very well with a bit of overshoot on top. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness with some different transitions. So there are plenty of darker shades now involved in the transitions, and this is where the powdery trailing, as I like to call it, becomes a bit more pronounced. But don't worry, it's not like you'd see on your typical VA model with smeary trailing or anything like that. The weaknesses stop well short of that, and they're not as obvious as on the PG32UQX either. Not to be confused with the PG32UQ, which is slightly slower than this BenQ, but not as slow as the PG32UQX. So with the makeshift roof here, for example, I can see some slightly more extended powdery trailing. And just in general, it's really just, again, a sort of mask of extra perceived blur. But really the AMA 2 setting, again, actually cuts down on this quite well overall. And yeah, there's some as well for the flag there against the background, and the tree in general, just a little bit more than you'd ideally see. There's also some overshoot mixed in. But overall, I would just reiterate again that I think BenQ's actually done a good job with the panel that they use here, although it isn't quite as fast as, for example, the Gigabyte M32U. And it does come with some overshoot if you're using the AMA 2 setting, and certainly above that. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate, so you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR. You could use that with a PS5, which doesn't support adaptive sync. You could use it with a PC as well. If you've got an NVIDIA GPU, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via HDMI 2.1. It also supports adaptive sync, so you can use AMD FreeSync, more specifically AMD FreeSync Premium Pro. Don't worry too much about this classification, it's just how AMD does it, certification level of this one. And there's also NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort. And as for AMD FreeSync, you can use that via HDMI as well. So you could use that with the Xbox Series X, for example. Or alternatively, you could be using HDMI 2.1 VRR in theory with that as well. So lots of options with VRR on this one. The variable refresh rate range, it is between 48 and 144 Hz. Below 48 Hz, it enters the LFC, low frame rate compensation boundary, or LFC kicks in. And as usual, there's a momentary slight stuttering when that occurs, but that's not something that everyone's going to notice, and generally you won't notice it unless you're frequently passing this boundary, you're sensitive enough to notice it, then it could be an issue. Below that boundary, below 48 frames a second, the refresh rate will stick to a multiple of the frame rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. And that's really what VRR is all about. It's about removing the mismatches between frame and refresh rate to get rid of tearing and stuttering that would otherwise occur. I've increased the graphics settings a bit just to drop my frame rate. It's now a little bit below 120 frames a second. And with this, there is a bit of an increase in overshoot. Remember, I'm using the AMA2 setting, although I wouldn't say this is an extreme increase in overshoot. So at this point, you may still like to use AMA2, but in terms of the tearing and stuttering, the VRR technology has got rid of that just fine. Just for reference, by the way, I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, connected via DisplayPort. I did test an AMD GPU with FreeSync as well, very similar in both cases on both GPUs. I didn't have any particular issues to report in terms of flickering or unexpected stuttering or anything like that. I've bumped up the graphics settings a little bit more just to get my frame rate into the double digits. It's now a bit below 100 frames a second or a bit above 90 frames a second. And what I would say is this hasn't really increased the overshoot very much compared to what I was showing at 120 Hz, and actually for some transitions it might even be slightly lower. This monitor appears to use some level of variable overdrive. Now, it isn't super effective, super well-tuned variable overdrive. It's not like you'd get with an NVIDIA G-Sync module, for example, or a monitor with an NVIDIA G-Sync module, but it does still turn things down a little bit. So with this AMA2 setting, where you notice a moderate amount of overshoot, even at 144 Hz, you'd usually notice that increase significantly. And compared to 144 frames a second, or even 120 frames a second for that matter, yes, there is an increase now in perceived blur due to eye movement, and there is a decrease in the connected feel. So ideally you do still want a high frame rate. It's just removal of the tearing and stuttering from mismatches between frame and refresh rate, which is really the purpose of VRR. I've now increased my graphics settings further. It's closer to 60 frames a second, or just a tiny bit above that. Overshoot levels have increased now. You'll probably be able to see this around the tree on the video now. But again, it's not extreme overshoot. It remains what I describe as moderate or perhaps moderately high in places now. If the monitor didn't use any form of variable overdrive, I would definitely expect more overshoot than this. So it is actually nice to see. If you're not too sensitive to overshoot, that means you could use AMA2 all the time. But if you are kind of sensitive to overshoot, you still like to use AMA2 generally, but it gets to this kind of stage, you might want to use AMA1 because the overshoot becomes a bit brighter, a bit more noticeable, and that's fine as well. You can do that. You can just switch over manually. It's very difficult to give general recommendations, but my general recommendation, if there is such a thing, would be AMA2 for triple-digit frame rates, AMA1 for double-digit frame rates. And another thing to be aware of is AMA1, the pixel response requirements are much lower now than they were at much higher refresh rates. You don't need the pixel responses to be as rapid for a good performance. So AMA1 actually works rather nicely down here as well. And it's not slow by any means, AMA1. It's actually a decent amount of acceleration, and I'd go as far as to say that compared to other monitors using this particular panel, even AMA1 gives it a bit of an edge. It's just AMA2 really sort of drives that home in my opinion, especially at the higher refresh rates. But again, it's going to come down to personal preferences which you use. I'm also just quickly going to mention this monitor does have a strobe backlight setting called blur reduction. That's explored in detail in the written review. You can find information about my subjective experiences. You can see pursuit photographs with that active. You can see brightness measurements, you know, the usual things. And that's a much better format for analysing this kind of thing than a video review is. But I will happily just give you a summary and say that the blur reduction on this monitor is actually quite decent. Because it has quantum dot backlights, you don't have issues with KSF phosphor flickering. So you don't have sort of magenta or red fringes, you don't have colourful flashes, that kind of thing. Yes, there is still flickering by the nature of how strobe backlight settings work. The brightness adjustment range is decent as well. It can go up to about 200 nits. But you can change the brightness, you can reduce it if you want, and that should be bright enough for most people, to be honest, but I know some people do like brighter. And just the overall strobe crosstalk wasn't extreme. Centrally, it was actually quite low. Centrally, which is the main area where your eyes will focus, so the sort of central bands of the screen. It is explored in more detail in the written review, but I just wanted to say that the blur reduction on this one's probably about as good as I've seen on a 4K UHD monitor. To wrap up then, in terms of the styling of the monitor, that's obviously quite an eye-catching feature because of the sort of orange or coral red colour you'll get with the stand. Not to everyone's taste, and I'm not a particular fan of the sort of toy-like feel of the stand base in general. The silver plastic is a little bit sort of hollow feeling. I much prefer premium metal stands myself, but the overall monitor has decent weight to it. The stand neck is nice and weighty, and good ergonomic flexibility as well. And if you really hate the stand but you like the monitor, you could always mount it with an alternative mount. I do like the included remote. I also like the integrated speakers. They're actually quite good as far as monitor integrated speakers go, so they're quite usable. The resolution and screen size, definitely a fan of that. 32 inches, 4K UHD, I like that combination. Nice pixel density, good amount of desktop real estate. I can very happily use this without any scaling. And a good level of immersion as well, just because of the size of the screen from a normal desktop viewing position. And if you're console gaming, you might want to sit a bit further back, or if you're just sort of relaxing on your couch, your sofa, or your bed, or whatever it might be, then the larger screen can facilitate that as well. In terms of the contrast performance, really as I'd expect from an IPS type panel, not the strongest I've seen, nor the weakest, sort of in the middle really. Moderate amount of IPS glow, as I'd expect again. Colour reproduction, nice generous colour gamut. Full Adobe RGB coverage, 96% of the DCI-P3 colour space covered. So this is good if you want to use the monitor for content creation on the side, although what I would say is that the gamma tracking is a bit wonky, and even if you tweak everything in the OSD, unless you're using the sRGB setting, the gamma is just off, to be honest. So you will need to profile it, but that is really something I generally recommend with any monitor if you're into content creation or colour critical work. The gamut itself at least gives good potential there. So does a strong colour consistency of the IPS type panel. No real complaints there. And just for general use, that's nice to have consistent colours and the overall saturation levels, the vibrancy. Some people will like that from the native gamut as well. And if you don't, there is an sRGB emulation setting, as I just mentioned, and that clamps the gamut very effectively. It's very good in that respect. Gamma tracking's good. Unfortunately, it does lock off the colour control. In terms of the HDR performance of the monitor, a bit of a mixed bag really. I did like it in terms of its colour gamut being put to good use, and that did give nice levels of vibrancy in places. But in terms of brightness and contrast, less impressive really. It offers 16 zone local dimming, so yes, I suppose it's better than no local dimming, or perhaps a lower number of dimming zones, 8 or fewer, but be under no illusion, that's a very limited number of dimming zones. It's not like an FALD solution, full array local dimming, mini LED, it isn't like OLED, nothing like that. It really is very limited. It just gives you a little bit of a situational edge and contrast. In terms of the brightness as well, my measurements were closer to 500 nits, not 600, as is really expected for this HDR level. And actually some at this level of HDR will go above 600 quite comfortably, so the brightness is a little bit limited at the top end. When it came to responsiveness, I think BenQ put this panel to good use. It isn't natively the most responsive panel out there, so they do have to push it quite hard, and I found the AMA2 setting, which does push it hard. I did play a lot of Battlefield, various different titles, Battlefield 5, Battlefield 4, Battlefield 1, 2042, the works, and I didn't find that I was sort of at any real competitive disadvantage using this monitor. Actually, I performed quite well, I found. Of course, mileage may vary, and it's always very subjective. It's not as well tuned or as fast as, for example, the Gigabyte M32U, but it does seem to be faster than other monitors sharing the same AUO panel as this BenQ. Very low input lag, very low signal delay as well, not a problem. VRR worked exactly as it should, also not a problem. And it even had some form of variable overdrive, or some level of variable overdrive, which was actually quite nice to see. So overall, I think this monitor could appeal to some people. It offers vibrant colour output. The responsiveness is pretty decent overall, really. Of course, you get HDMI 2.1 as well, for good compatibility with modern games consoles. And it's not restricted in any way, that's full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 as well. In terms of comparisons with other monitors, because I do have to draw some, this one isn't the cheapest monitor out there. At time of review, it's around $1,000 US, although that seems to be slightly discounted. It sometimes goes for a little bit beyond that, and it does depend on your market. It will be more expensive in some markets. So I would compare that to the Gigabyte M32U, which I've been doing really throughout this review, and talking about responsiveness mainly. The Gigabyte is a bit different. Yeah, it is a bit stronger in terms of its responsiveness, but it doesn't have the same wide colour gamut as the BenQ. It doesn't offer as much DCI-P3 coverage, definitely doesn't offer as much Adobe RGB coverage. so things aren't as vibrant. It doesn't have the same HDR certification level, although in terms of its brightness, it's actually quite similar. And it even has local dimming, which isn't as well implemented as the BenQ in my opinion, but it actually does have the same number of dimming zones, which was quite interesting. And yeah, so it's just a cheaper option and one which I'm just sort of more comfortable recommending in general. But if you really know you like strong vibrancy, and that's really important for you, or you really just after that full bandwidth HDMI 2.1, perhaps you game on the PS5 and this has a bit of an issue with the sort of color signal which is supported, perhaps the BenQ does make sense. You can then compare with other monitors which use this panel. I've already mentioned that responsiveness is stronger with this BenQ. Another one I like to compare with, because I've received a lot of sort of good feedback about it, is MSI's version of this panel, the MPG 321URQD, I believe it is. And you could of course compare it to other monitors which use the same panel from the likes of Asus ViewSonic. I already feel that really this video is sort of pushing everyone for time, so I'm just going to wrap up there and just leave a link to a thread which discusses various competitors to this monitor in the description of the video. And you'll also find a link to the written review there, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, nice way of showing your support as well.